My name is Paul White and I'm the CEO of the Hidden Disabilities Sunflower Scheme. A very warm welcome to the inaugural Hidden in Heritage Festival, a festival of stories around hidden disabilities in heritage, where you will gain insights into what life was like for people living with hidden disabilities in the past, changes and progress made to improve their quality of life and develop into a more inclusive world. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for generously donating their time. I encourage you to please ask questions throughout the day on Twitter using our hashtag HidHeritageFestival. I will now pass you over to Ruthanne Baxter to introduce the first speaker and formally launch the festival. Ruthanne is currently the Museums Manager at the University of Edinburgh and has a passion for heritage and inclusion. Ruthanne, along with our own team of Annette Schmeller and Paul Shriver, has been the driving force in bringing the festival to you, and I'm very grateful to Ruthanne, Annette and Paul for all their time, efforts and passion. Over to you, Ruthanne.
Thank you for joining us today for what we believe is the first and only festival in the world that focuses on the heritage and history of hidden disabilities. I am someone who has a sibling with a hidden disability. My youngest sister Hannah has a rare neurological condition called West syndrome, and because of that she suffers from epilepsy and has learning disabilities. So whenever I got in touch with Annette at the Sunflower Scheme at the Hidden Disabilities Company, we were talking about the increase of online events during lockdown, and we thought, well, isn't this a great opportunity to bring some of the stories and the histories of hidden disabilities into people's homes? So here we are. All our speakers today readily, kindly and generously agreed to offer their presentations, and they are a wonderful range of experts and very dedicated volunteers and people who come from the world of arts and culture, and they have a great deal to share. And I'm sure, like a lot of history, some of the stories will be very amusing, some will be very moving, and some will be upsetting. And we do have in the festival some historical terminology that is offensive to modern society, but hopefully we will be able to look back in future and hope that in 2020 people are not saying that about the language and the terminology we currently use around hidden disabilities. So on with the first event, and I would be introducing Dr. Iain Hutchison, who is a research associate in the Centre for the History of Medicine at the University of Glasgow. He is author of Feeling Our History and a board member of the Disability History Association, among many other things. In this morning's presentation, Outdoor Blind People in Edwardian Scotland, Iain will be focusing on the activities and stories of a recent project supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund, RNIB Scotland and the Lothian Health Services Archives. Over to Iain.
Good morning, everyone. The title of this paper is The Hidden Histories of People with Sight Loss in Edwardian Edinburgh and the Scottish Borders. And naturally enough, the paper is about blind people who lived in Edinburgh, Scotland's capital, and its neighbouring counties, and during the period of the early 20th century. The story kicked off a few years ago when I was invited to evaluate some annual reports, some old books and other historical materials held by RNIB Scotland. The organisation has its roots in societies for outdoor blind people that began from the 1850s and encompassed the whole of Scotland by the 1880s. Most of these items told a story of outside intervention into the lives of blind people, notably teaching them to read embossed text so that they might read the Bible. The blind recipients of this outreach were faceless, abstract, unknown, hidden. But one item in the collection offered the prospect of bringing some of these historical actors out of hiding. This was a ledger, a register of outdoor blind, which had been compiled by the Society for the Outdoor Blind between around 1903 and 1910. Outdoor blind people were people who lived in their own homes, sometimes in single rooms and narrow lanes. Sometimes they were boarders in lodging houses, or even paupers in poor houses. The missions to outdoor blind covering Edinburgh, the Borders, and indeed the Lothians was set up in 1857, and it was the first such society in Scotland. Its aim was to engage with people with sight loss who did not fall under the patronage of Edinburgh's Blind Asylum and its workshops. These were located in a prominent place in Nicholson Street, which you can see depicted in the slide. By contrast, the people that the mission was interested in consisted mostly of those who Edinburgh's Blind Asylum did not see as productive workers, people lacking the stamina or the dexterity to work long hours on such tasks as weaving, knitting, canework, and mattress making. Many were elderly, and of these, some had only lost their sight in old age through the likes of cataract. But there were also younger men and women who had lost their sight through accidents, such as workplace explosions, or had been born blind or lost their sight during childhood as the result of the likes of measles or smallpox. And the next image shows you the mission at its work. The register had been haphazardly compiled. Some entries gave addresses, cause of sight loss, age, means of livelihood, ability to read, raise, type, and other details. But there were many entries that consisted of no more than a name, inferring that these were people with whom the society had little, if indeed any, engagement. Despite the incomplete nature of the register, it struck me as offering interesting and exciting possibilities. Katrina Burness of RNIB Scotland was instrumental in garnering the support of the Heritage Lottery Fund, Lothian Health Services Archive at the University of Edinburgh, and the National Records of Scotland at Register House. To give its support to a historical research project, the Heritage Lottery Fund looked at such things as the generation of new skills for volunteers and innovative outcomes. So research volunteers were recruited, including several who had sight loss, their involvement having particular value to the outreach agenda. The initial outcomes focused on a book that would be produced in a variety of formats, including large print, Braille, and audio. Also to be offered were podcasts that would be guided and hosted by RNIB Scotland's Insight Radio, since rebranded as Connect Radio. Researchers were trained on how to trace people on the register through such National Records of Scotland sources as birth, death and marriage registrations and decennial census returns. While their work kicked off, we began thinking ahead to the format of the podcasts. In our initial meeting with Insight Radio, it was suggested that the podcasts would benefit from an introductory theme tune. This caught us on the hop. What might we be able to offer? How would we go about it? I then recalled hearing a band play some numbers at an unrelated event some weeks earlier. One singer had done a couple of solo turns, and I had made a point of telling her after the event that I had really enjoyed her singing. I had no idea who she was, but after some inquiries, I tracked her down. Her name is Sarah Caltieri. Do you by any chance compose songs as well as sing, I asked. Yes, she responded. But what did we want of her? I felt that we did not want a doleful song about poor blind people. We wanted something that was a bit upbeat. But in what genre? What entertainment did people pursue during the Edwardian period of the register? One activity engaged in by blind people in Edwardian Edinburgh was as street musicians. These were trades that the missionaries frowned upon with indignant displeasure, but they existed nonetheless. So what might blind street singers and musicians have been performing in order to attract the loose change of passers-by? This wasn't immediately apparent, but it seemed reasonable to assume that the best tactic for performers would be to give audiences entertainment that was in demand at the time, and that was music hall and popular numbers performed by household names such as Harry Lauder and Marie Lloyd. Something akin to music hall was perhaps the answer. We decided to give Sarah a free hand, but as our research into case studies developed, I fed her vignettes of some of the characters in the hope that these might help. The song will probably not mean a lot to listeners, and I will come back to that later, but here is Sarah's song. It's called Have a Cup of Tea.
Sadie was just 10 when her ma was whisked away to the place for them who've lost their heads, or so they say. She'd led a sad, hard life, domestic servant to her own, then landed in strife in the poorhouse all alone. Come on in, welcome to our booking house. We'll squeeze you in, how'd you like your tea? Come on down, you can help fix our abode. Just half a crown for the princes of the town. She was taken in by a basket weaver and his kin, got a job in a restaurant bar where she met Livingston. But then he was called up by HM Naval in Orkney. A destroyer smashed their boat and the rest is history. Come on in, welcome to our booking house. We'll squeeze you in, how'd you like your tea? Come on down, you can help fix our boat. Just half a crown for the princes of the town. Sadie got the news, she decided it was time to go, that she had paid her dues. It was a cardiac, the records show. But Sadie was wise, she'd seen a place she'd rather be, with all them upstairs, having a cup of tea. Come on in, welcome to our booking house. We'll squeeze you in, how'd you like your tea? Come on down, you can help fix our boat. Just half a crown for the princes of the town.
Like many major cities, Edinburgh had a blind asylum. The Edinburgh Institution dates from 1793, and through the 19th century, its activities expanded from being a refuge to providing employment in its workshops, and in the 1870s, education through the absorption of the Edinburgh Blind School. In the Victorian and Edwardian era, the blind asylum was guided by a strong moral and religious code. It provided relatively well-paid employment for its workers, but they had to conform to the rules and ethos of the institution, such as participating in a routine of daily prayers and the attendance at church on Sundays. The outdoor blind people that the missionaries sought out in the closes off the Cowgate and the villages of Roxburghshire and Berwickshire were often without work and were in needy situations. However, the missionaries did not, in the early decades of their work, seek these impoverished people in order to feed their bellies. They too had an evangelistic agenda, and it was their starved souls that they sought to nourish. The full title of this outdoor mission was the Edinburgh Society for Promoting Reading Amongst the Blind at Their Own Homes on Moon's System. The name might suggest that the Society's aim was educational in teaching adults to read. But what were they to read? You probably already guessed that, of course, this was to be the Bible and other teachings from the scriptures. What was the Moon System? When the Edinburgh Society set up, Braille was in its infancy. Braille was preceded by various forms of raised type, and by the 1850s and 1860s, one of these, a system developed by William Moon, who you can see here, was in wide use. Unlike, for example, the angular motifs used by some competing systems and the groups of dots used in Braille, Moon's system was mostly based on raised adaptations of the alphabet that were effectively letters familiar to sighted people, but in a simplified form. This style was credited with being particularly accessible to people who had lost their sight in adulthood, and by which time their fingers had lost the sensitivity and nimbleness of childhood. Moon raised type snaked down the page, as you see here, from left to right, then right to left, making it easy for readers to keep their place as they move from line to line. This extract reads, "Come unto me, all ye who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." So that's what the Society was about. But who were the outdoor blind and what did they do? The Society had been running for nearly 50 years when the Register, which formed the basis of the Seeing Our History research project, was compiled. However, we quickly found that to understand people's lives, it was not logical just to focus on the brief 8-year period during which names were being entered within the Register's pages. Indeed, we learned that we not only had to trace the complete lives of individuals, it turned out family networks were also exceedingly important to the life stories. So we found our overall research stretching in instances as far back as the 1780s and forward to the 1960s. What kind of experiences did people encounter during their lives? I have 3 case studies that I'd like to tell you about today. The first one is about Mary Isabella Howie, who lived from 1882 until 1964. When the small team of research volunteers began their work, they were each given 20 folders, 20 cases on which to work. They ultimately had several hundred files that we wanted them to work through. Moira, one of our team, took a long time to complete her first bundle, and there was so much yet to do, but there was a reason for her seemingly slow progress. Moira had struck lucky and right at the outset had found a meaty case, one which ultimately took its place in our book. Mary Isabella Howie was born in an apartment at 108 George Street in Edinburgh's fashionable new town. Her father was George Frederick James Lindsay Howie. He lived from about 1854 till 1890, and he was a member of a family of significant standing as artists and, adopting new technology, photographers. Mary's mother, also Mary, came from more humble origins in Edinburgh's Fountain Bridge, where her father was a hay carter. When Mary Liddell married in October 1880, she was already heavily pregnant with her first child, George, who arrived a month later. At this time, Lindsay Howie, as he was known throughout his life, was established in the Howie family's photographic business in Princes Street, and they lived in an apartment adjoining the studio. Their daughter, Mary, was born 2 years later. The Register suggests that Mary was blind from infancy. While Lindsay Howie was described as a photographic artist and a portrait painter, during the last 5 years of his life, it seems to have seriously come off the rails, and he had become estranged from his wife and children, and also from his brother, who now ran the Princess Street photographic studio. By 1890, he was a pauper, living in a lodging house in the Cowgate, and he was being aided under the Poor Law by Edinburgh City Parish. His occupation was described as street artist. Later that year, he died in Edinburgh Royal Asylum. His daughter, Mary, was 8 years of age. A few months later, Mary and her 2 brothers were living with their grandparents, her 60-year-old grandfather, now a railway porter, and their widowed mother was working as a rubber coat maker. Mary was a pupil at the blind school. When Mary's name first appeared on the register around 1905, she was 23 years old, and she had moved with her brothers, widowed mother and grandmother to a tenement dwelling at 16 Lothian Place in an industrial locality in the West End of Edinburgh. Mary lived in Lothian Place initially with her mother, grandmother and brothers, George and Thomas. George left Lothian Place when he married. Thomas's later life has not been traced. Did he die in military service during the Great War? Mary died at Craiglockhart Hospital in 1964 at the grand age of 81. But 16 Lothian Place remained her home until the very end of her life. She had lived here for 6 decades. The story of Mary and her family appears to have been a turbulent one. Her mother's marriage from a humble working class environment into an established, creative and commercial family should have ensured a comfortable life for her. But her parents' relationship appears to have been a turbulent one. Her father eventually spiraling into descent to pauperism and early death in the lunatic asylum. During these trials, it was Mary's working class maternal grandparents who gave stability to her childhood. She had a long life, she did not marry, and she appears to have lived as a strong, independent woman. The second case is about Robert Ponton, born in 1857, and he died in 1932. So after the polluted environment of Edinburgh's rubber factories, we do need some fresh air, and this is where we go out into the countryside to meet Robert Ponton. Robert was born to Thomas Ponton, a shepherd, and his wife Christina on 14 April 1857 at East Mains in the parish of Whittingham. This is in Haddingtonshire, which is now better known as East Lothian. Robert had 3 other older siblings, John, Christina, who I'll call Chrissy, and Thomas. 2 years later, they were joined by a baby sister, Jane, the whole family living in a one-room cottage at Whittingham Home Farm by 1861. In 1866, their father was struck down by bowel cancer, and the task of registering his death fell to the eldest son, John, who was 16 at that time. Robert Ponton is an example of a register entry so lacking in detail to be suggestive that his existence came to the missionaries only as anecdotal information rather than him being known to them personally. He's one of the mystery cases. While his family story is typical of the tribulations experienced by so many people through the later 19th century and into the 20th century, there's little to be traced on Robert insofar as his visual impairment is concerned. That perhaps makes Robert a case of interest. And here's an image of the rural setting in which he was growing up. Following the death of Christina's husband, the family sustained itself moderately in their adversity. This being made possible by the older sons taking on responsibilities of adulthood. In 1871, Thomas, aged 15, and Robert, aged 13, were supporting their widowed mother and younger siblings working as agricultural labourers in the parish of Stenton. Their elder brother, John, and sister Christina had already left home. But there were younger siblings. There was Jessie Ann, aged 8, and there was Jane, aged 6. This was the second Jane, the first having died and her name being given to a new daughter, a not uncommon practice. And finally, there was Alexander, aged 6 months. Hang on, Alexander, aged 6 months? Where did he come from? Over the remainder of the 19th century, the nucleus of the family consisted of George and Robert, neither of whom were married, and their little brother, Alexander. Indeed, the three men appear to have been the stabilising force of the family. Their mother, Christina, died in 1900, and by 1901, Thomas and Alexander were both ploughmen on Adniston Farm in Gladsmuir parish, and as such they were probably important members of the agricultural community. Chrissy, now 38, and like the men, still single, kept house for them. Robert, who is the focus of this story, also lived with them on Adniston Farm. He was 42 years of age, and he was designated as shepherd retired. It is at this time that his blindness is first recorded. It therefore seems that Robert was blinded in midlife, but we don't know the cause of the loss of his sight. A decade later, Thomas, Robert, and Alexander appear to have found increased financial security. They had moved from Haddingtonshire to the parish of Fowlis Wester in Perthshire, where Thomas and Alexander were recorded as farmers, while Robert was attributed as living on private means. Robert was not recorded as blind in this census. Why was this? Well, since the previous census, blindness for this 10-year statistical survey of the population had been redefined. In 1911, blindness had been changed to mean totally blind. This created a situation, for example, where children in Edinburgh's blind school, who were no longer blind in the eyes of the census if they had some residual vision. So it would appear that Robert had some degree of impaired eyesight and therefore was no longer recorded in the census as blind. Chrissy was no longer with her brothers in 1911. She had died of heart disease in 1907, aged 53. In 1912, Thomas died. Soon after, baby brother Alexander moved to Dundee, where he married and became a restaurateur. Brother George enjoyed greater longevity than his siblings, passing away in 1956, a retired farm servant aged 86. But with the loss of Chrissy and Thomas through death, and the later departure of Alexander through marriage, what became of our partially sighted Robert? We don't know when the farm in Perthshire was given up exactly, but Robert moved into Perth itself, where he lived in the delightfully named Pomerium Street. It had once bordered an orchard, and so its name, but by this time, as you can see in the next image, it was a street of low-rise tenements close to Perth city centre. Robert had lived as part of a close unit with his siblings for a number of years, and with records showing him as retired by his early 40s. It might therefore be tempting to think that his sight loss had made him dependent upon his brothers. But I choose to speculate that this was not really the case. And in his later life, when he had moved to Perth, Robert appears to have been an independent spirit, looking after himself and doing so quite contentedly. At the age of 74, he succumbed to bronchitis. And I rather like this bit. It was recorded that he had been found dead in bed at 5 a.m, last seen alive March 4th, 11 p.m. This suggests that he had been out the night before, perhaps socialising in one of Perth's taverns, for medicinal purposes only, of course, had returned home and died peacefully in his sleep. At least it would be nice to think so. But who truly were the siblings of Robert and George? Of John, Christina, Thomas, and Jessie Ann, there is no doubt. Jane, as mentioned earlier, turned out to be not one sister, but two. The first, Jane, was born in 1860, but died in 1862 in her second year. Thomas and Christina then had another daughter in 1864, for whom they adopted a widely practiced custom of using the same forename of the deceased child for a new arrival. But as Thomas Sr. died 2 years after the birth of the second Jane in 1866, and Christina, his wife, had not remarried, who were the mysterious George and Alexander? Although these children were passed off as Christina's children, in reality both George and Alexander, born nearly 10 years apart, were the illegitimate sons of Christina's daughter, Chrissy. Chrissy was working as an agricultural labourer in a nearby parish, age 18, when she became pregnant with George. She returned home in 1870 to give birth to her son before returning to Stenton village alone to work as a domestic servant. A decade later, history repeated itself when, in 1879, she gave birth to Alexander in the family's home parish of Whittingham. Chrissy never married. It appears that the scandals of illegitimate births were absorbed by Chrissy's widowed mother, Christina, and that she took on the shame of these fatherless births. But how did the men feel about their mothers? We have no way of knowing, but there may be one clue. Alexander, when he moved to Dundee, married Jessie Dow in 1912, and they had a daughter the following year. Their daughter was named Christine Ponton. The Ponton family had a tough life in the early years, particularly in the aftermath of the early death of Robert's father. However, this is a family that seemed to do what had to be done. The boys worked hard from an early age, and their mother looked out for them and protected their sister, Chrissy, whose illiteracy suggests that she had gained little benefit from childhood schooling and went wayward not once, but twice. And not necessarily because of her weaknesses, we don't know. However, the sons and grandsons stuck together and worked their way up to a situation of security, noted in their move to Perthshire. Robert seems to have been a character of independent mind. He did not fall under the clutches of the missionaries to the outdoor blind following his loss of sight, and he remained independent until the very end of his life. I quite like Robert. The last case is a double-barrel one, if you like. It's mother and daughter. I emphasise the importance of the wider family genealogy in researching these cases. And this is about Lizzie Hoseason, who lived from 1873 to 1914, and her daughter Sophia, who later became known as Sadie, who lived from 1898 to 1951. As I mentioned, a big influence on the story of each person studied was the part played by their wider family networks that changed as they passed through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and old age. Our singer, Sarah Caltieri, was intrigued by the story of Lizzie Hoseason and her illegitimate daughter. Not all of our life stories were sad ones. There were many with prolonged happy outcomes and depicting people with sight loss who exercised high levels of independence and control over their own destinies. This was perhaps despite the efforts of the missionaries from the Society for the Outdoor Blind to direct their lives, tell them what work they might do and should not do, such as street entertaining, and by instilling blind people with their own middle-class religious and moral values. However, Lizzie's story was not always a happy one, nor was that of her daughter Sadie. Lizzie was born in Leith in 1873. Her father, Peter Hoseason, was from Unst, the most northerly of the Shetland Isles, and he worked in various low-skilled jobs in Leith. He married Lizzie's mother, Margaret Taylor, a local Leith girl, when she was already 4 months pregnant with Lizzie. You can see a pattern here. The couple went on to have a further 5 children. Lizzie experienced sight loss in her mid-teens, and she was admitted to Edinburgh School for the Blind. However, she was probably too old at that point to gain much benefit from lessons, and she left 1 year later. By this time, her family was fragmented and in economic distress. For example, it was by the Inspector of Poor for St Cuthbert's Parish in Edinburgh that Lizzie had been sent to the blind school. Her mother, Margaret Hoseason, died in 1898. At this time, Lizzie was in Cradlelocker Poorhouse, and she was 8 months pregnant. We don't know the circumstances. Had Lizzie had a romance and then been deserted by the father of her unborn child? We don't know. She had worked as a domestic servant, often a dangerous job for the virtue of young women. Had she been taken advantage of below stairs? Had she been ejected by her family because of the scandal, abandoned to giving birth in the poorhouse? With this kind of research, there are always many unanswered questions, leaving historians to speculate. And that can be a dangerous route to follow, of course. Lizzie's baby girl was given the rather elegant name of Sophia. Baby Sophia was fully sighted, but she did not enter the world under the most auspicious circumstances. Sophia's story was clearly affected by her mother's life. When Sophia was 10 years old, her mother was admitted to Bangor Village, which was the district asylum for Mid-Lothian. And here you can see the asylum's register photograph of her mother. The trauma of poverty and caring for family members and her daughter, it seems, had taken its toll on Lizzie's mental well-being. In this case, it appears that there were social circles with a nominal blind community, possibly resulting from friendships made by Lizzie when at the blind school. With Lizzie admitted to Bangor, Sophia boarded with James Clingan and his family. Clingan was a blind basket maker employed by the workshops in Nicholson Street. And there was also another blind lodger in the household. So there were networks amongst several blind people living around this area. Sophia was attending school at this time. Again, we lose track of Sophia until she was found working as a restaurant waitress. She had been known as Sophia throughout her childhood, but as an adult, she had changed this to Sadie. She was 23 when she married Leith trawler fisherman Livingston Isaac, who was 10 years her junior. Sadie's mother had been dead for 8 years by this time. When Sadie married, she was not pregnant. She had work. So was the grass under Sadie's feet greener than it had been for her mother? You might think so, and it probably was. But then World War II intervened. Livingston, with his experience of the sea, would have been viewed as an asset when he was deployed as an engineman on the HMS Alberic, a Royal Navy patrol vessel in the Orkney Islands. His Majesty's ship Alberic sounds very grand, but here it is. Now, if you look at the image, the Alberic is the vessel in the lower right-hand corner. The Alberic was no more than a steam trawler, a fishing boat, which had been requisitioned and pressed into service as a minesweeper in 1840. Livingston was serving on the Alberic in 1941, when it was sunk in Scapa Flow, not by enemy action, but when it was hit by the Royal Navy destroyer HMS St Albans. The image shows you the contrast between the two vessels. The Alberic sunk with the loss of all crew members. Sadie was now a widow. She died 10 years later of a cardiac condition, or was it a broken heart? As Sarah speculates in her song, Sadie was wise. She'd seen a place she'd rather be, with all them upstairs having a cup of tea.
whisked away to the place for them who've lost their heads, or so they say. She'd led a sad, hard life, domestic servant to her own, then landed in strife in the poorhouse all alone. Come on in, welcome to our booking house. We'll squeeze you in, how'd you like your tea? Come on down, you can help fix our abode. Just half a crown for the princes of the town. She was taken in by a basket weaver and his kin, got a job in a restaurant bar where she met Livingston. But then he was called up by HM Naval in Orkney. A destroyer smashed their boat and the rest is history. Come on in, welcome to our booking house. We'll squeeze you in, how'd you like your tea? Come on down, you can help fix our abode. Just half a crown for the princes of the town. When Sadie got the news, she decided it was time to go, that she had paid her dues. It was a cardiac, the records show. But Sadie was wise. She'd seen a place she'd rather be, with all them upstairs, having a cup of tea. Come on in, welcome to our booking house. We'll squeeze you in, how'd you like your tea? Come on down, you can help fix our abode. Just half a crown for the princes of the town.
So in conclusion, these are glimpses of 3 of the people with their families that appear on the register for Outdoor Blind. In all of them, wider family networks were important and influential. Sadly, Lizzie Hoseason became a tragic figure, but Mary Howie had a long life, and Robert Ponton, who also saw out more than 10 years, was a free spirit. Our research volunteers have ferreted out other stories, each quite different from the rest, which show that people with sight loss a century ago cannot be stereotyped. Everyone was different and each had their own story to tell. So thank you very much for your attention, everyone, and I would be delighted to try and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.